Hey quiet village, a single scream, and winter claimed its first soul. Welcome to Marple Manor. I am your host Hartwell. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Your words make this journey warmer. Let's begin. The first snow had come early to St. Giles-on-Wear, laying a delicate sugar dusting atop the privet hedges and the thatch, brightening every poor thing that had no right to look festive in November. By 3 in the afternoon the sky had the colour of pewter. By 4 the village hall windows were throwing rectangles of lamplight onto the white, making the footpaths shine like ribbons. Inside, the annual holly and cinnamon bazaar was in full bustling swing. There were raffles and a stall for needlework, a modest table of second-hand books and, somewhat controversially, though no one admitted to minding, a corner given over to curiosities of the county, which was rather a grand name for a tray of old brooches and chipped snuff-boxes. The vicar's wife had twisted paper chains with the schoolchildren, and during the last half-hour, Mrs. Eliza Hardcastle had sold 9 jars of her quince marmalade by the ruthless expedient of pressing samples upon men too polite to refuse. A band of scouts attempted God Rest You Merry. Gentlemen, with that brave determination that forgives a multitude of flattened notes. In all of this, Miss Marple moved lightly and almost invisibly, with the little gliding step of an elderly lady who never means to be in anyone's way. Her cheeks were pink from the cold. She had walked from the High Street because the lanes were too treacherous for her nephew Raymond's motor car, and she carried her knitting in a small bag that had once held sugar ration coupons. She bought a faded copy of the Golden Treasury for 6pence, refused a slice of seed cake without appearing to refuse anything at all, and when she thought no one was looking, watched everybody. It does one good, she had told Mrs. West, the postmistress earlier that week, to see how people cluster in the cold weather. One learns most when people think they are only warming their hands. There were several new faces to warm. Mr. Horace Pember, recently retired from a successful career importing ornamental glass, had rented the handsome Tudor cottage by the mill stream. A man of eager smiles and agreeable old-fashioned courtesy, he had already promised a new boiler for the hall, a small thing, but the least a neighbour can do, and had outbid everybody for Mrs. Hardcastle's cakes at the last church auction, which gratified Mrs. Hardcastle and irritated nearly everyone else. He moved now through the room with a glass of mulled wine, patting shoulders, warming palms between his own, as if kindliness could be transferred by contact. Near the curiosities tray stood Clarissa Vale, the young proprietress of the antiquarian shop on the High Street. Clarissa had come down from London in June, under the rummaged cloud of gossip that attends any woman who arrives unaccompanied with tastefully minimal luggage. She wore a plain navy dress and a small hat, pinned at an angle that was either careless or perfect. Her eyes moved over the cheap brooches without interest, until, almost as if it had been placed there to catch only her attention, she found a little oval locket with a pattern of ivy leaves. She had the air of someone deciding whether to pick up a child or a bomb. Dr. Imogen Exley, brisk and kind and entirely unromantic in her flannel skirt, had been coaxed into drawing the numbers for the hamper raffle. By the tea-urn, Thomas Wilde, the schoolmaster, tried to convince the vicar's wife that the Nature Walk Fund ought to be spent on books instead of boots, and the vicar's wife, very fairly, attempted to persuade Thomas that books without boots would get soaked to no purpose. "There you are, Miss Marple," said Mrs. West, emerging from behind a stack of wrapped soaps like a conjurer producing rabbits. "Do try the scones. Cook swears there's clotted cream, though between ourselves I don't see how she's done it." "Clotted cream is a matter of stubbornness," Miss Marple said. "So is quid pro quo if you look closely." She folded her knitting into her bag and glanced, purely by accident, of course, along the curve of the room. Mr. Pember was listening to someone with his head slightly bent. Clarissa Vale was still not touching the locket. Dr. Exley was calling out "Blue 37" with a voice that brooked no appeals. And by the door, Half concealed by the mufflers and wet umbrellas, a tall gentleman with the habitual neatness of a clerk was brushing snow off a sleeve with 2 fingers. He had come in quietly and had not made the least effort to be noticed. Miss Marple watched the 2 fingers for a second longer than politeness required, and then accepted a scone. "Ladies and gentlemen," called Mrs. Hardcastle, rattling a spoon against a teacup, "we shall have the hamper drawn in 2 minutes. 2 minutes? Mind, and then, if the Reverend Fenwick will permit, the children will do their recitation about King Wenceslas. Mind you, it has actions." There was a general cheerful groan. 1 or 2 people clapped as a matter of duty. Several drifted toward the trestle table, where the hamper, tied up in cellophane fat with preserves and biscuits, an orange set on top like a crown, shone softly under the lamps. Mr. Pember's voice rose above the friendly hubbub. "There's the spirit of the thing, my dears," he cried. "Whoever wins, we've all had our share, I hope." "One must always have one's share," Clarissa Vale murmured, and Miss Marple, standing a measured 2 feet away, thought the tone not quite as bland as it might have been. Clarissa did not look up when Mr. Pember, passing by, gave her a little bow as if to a fellow conspirator in delight. She had slipped at last the locket into her pocket. Very careful, that. Very light fingers, and a faint green smear upon the glove. Polish, Miss Marple judged. The inexpensive kind used for warming stoves. Curious. Blue. 42. Cried Dr. Exley. "Is blue 42 anywhere?" There was a murmur, a rustle of tickets, laughter at someone having blue 24 and hoping to reassemble the digits by prayer. A child near the stage giggled and pointed. The hamper ribbon had tugged loose and was trailing like a banner. The Reverend Fenwick, a conscientious man of large bones, stepped forward, retied it with a seriousness that would have done credit to a sacrament, and in doing so dropped his spectacles into the straw. There was good-humoured confusion as 3 people looked for them. The scouts, thrilled at useful employment, crowded about with such enthusiasm that the straw drifted like pale confetti onto the floor. "Dear me," Miss Marple said mildly, to no one in particular. "How easily things come apart when one pulls a little at the end. Blue 42, repeated Dr. Exley. "No? Very well, Blue." The tall, neat gentleman by the door, whom no one appeared to know, had taken 1 step inside the crowded space and then stopped, like a person at a threshold uncertain of the rules. His gaze passed over Miss Marple without hitching, went through Mr. Pember, as though Pember were a pane of curiously shaped glass, and returned to the hamper as if it contained something other than tea biscuits. He had a thin mouth and a complexion that spoke of office air and regular lunches. He lifted his 2 fingers once more to the sleeve, not flicking away snow now, but touching something else. Sticky, perhaps, resin. Miss Marple could not decide at this distance, but she noted, because it was second nature to note, that he wore no gloves in a room where even the vicar had not quite dared take his off. Hands accustomed to cold were either labouring hands or hands that did not feel it when they ought. "Blue 59, said Dr. Exley, triumphant. "At last." "It's me," cried Mrs. West, and was applauded. And then there was the usual discussion of whether she ought to take it or give it to the lot, which was settled by Mr. Pember's declaring gallantly that he would see to a second hamper. At once, the very thing, which settled him more agreeably into the centre of attention than he had been even before. It was at that juncture, when the second hamper was being conjured into possibility, and the children, with grave and alarmingly slow movement, had begun their actions, that the hall door banged inward again. A gust of snow came in, and with it Alice Pember, Mr. Pember's niece, her coat unbuttoned, her hat askew, her eyes wide in a way that had nothing to do with weather. "Uncle," she said, but not to her uncle, to the room. "Uncle!" she swallowed. "He's outside." The Reverend Fenwick, sensible, went to her with a hand held out. Thomas Wilde, quick as a sportsman to a fallen ball, slipped through the press and to the door. There was a moment's pause, like the pause in a cottage when the fire sucks in breath before it flares. Then someone began to move, and then everyone, and the door became a fluster of bodies and voices. Miss Marple did not move at all for 3 seconds. She set down her teacup carefully, and lifting the fringe of her scarf, made her way along the wall until she was beside the hat rack. Outside, the snow had thickened to flakes as soft as dust. A few steps from the entrance, where the lamplight thinned and fell away, something dark lay against the fresh white. Thomas Wilde knelt with a schoolmaster's awkwardness, one knee already wet through. Dr. Exley pushed past, no solemnity now, only practice. "Stand back, all of you," she said. "Give me room, Mr. Fenwick, keep them back, please. Oh, Alice, my dear, stand with Mrs. West. Yes, thank you." Mr. Pember did not stand back. He was already there. Indeed, it was he lying there. He had fallen on his side, one arm crooked under him, as though he had been listening at the ground for news, and the news had put him to sleep. His breath did not fog the cold air. His cheek had a curious glaze, like glass left to frost overnight. On the lapel of his dark overcoat a sprig of yew, which someone had thought cheerful enough to pin there, lay half-crushed and trailed a smear of something dark on the wool. Dr. Exley's hands were quick and steady. She bent, touched, waited, touched again. The small sounds of the village, all those polite winter noises of cleared throats and polite sorrow, went down to silence. "No," she said at last, and her voice was very even, the way it is when one is kind and cannot be anything else. "No, he is gone." Alice Pember's cry was not loud, but it felt loud because it made room in the cold for all the things that fill grief, shock, and then the immediate urgent need for explanation. How? Who? The questions gathered like breath. From the door the tall, neat stranger watched, his face as impassive as the snow. He had not come forward. He had not gone away. His right hand, ungloved, hung close to his side, and even at that distance Miss Marple, whose eyes were not what they had been, could see that the fingertips shone faintly, as if varnished. "Fetch the police," the Reverend Fenwick said, low and absolutely certain. "Mrs. West, if you please. And no one else is to leave the hall." He looked suddenly older. He looked like a man set to keep a gate against a tide. Miss Marple stood a little apart, back within the door, not so far inside that the shudder of cold could not find her. She noted with that tidy absorption that had nothing in it of heartlessness 3 small things: the way the snow-banked path showed a double line of footprints to the edge and only one returning, the ribbon from the hamper caught around the iron boot-scraper and trailing in the disturbed snow like a pale, thin snake, and the little oval locket, now suddenly not in Clarissa Vale's pocket at all, but glinting, just once, because snow does mute light, beneath the rim of the hall step where someone's heel had kicked it free. "Oh dear," Miss Marple murmured, almost as if she had dropped a stitch. "Oh dear, oh dear." The scouts, because no adult had told them to be brave, were brave as rabbits are. They watched with huge eyes and did not run. Mr. Wilde stood and took off his hat without seeming to know he had done so. Alice Pember pressed her hands together, hard, as though she would squeeze the event into sense by force. Clarissa Vale bent very calmly, and with 2 fingers retrieved the locket from the snow. She did not look at Miss Marple when she straightened. She did not look at anyone. She slipped the locket into her bag, and her mouth made a line so neat a dressmaker might have basted it. In the hush that followed, the church clock struck 4. Each note fell upon the village like a pin into a cushion. Things do not happen in St. Giles-on-Wear at 4 in the afternoon in November, but something had happened, and lay on the snow to prove it. It was not only the first snow that had come early, it was the winter's first victim, and in the warm bright hall, where paper chains dangled and tea steamed in cups, a small, quiet lady with a scarf of good wool and hands that kept even now a memory of knitting, began to consider, not the snow nor the redness on the lapel, nor even the thin stranger's shining fingertips, but the old, stubborn matter she understood best, what people do when they think they are unseen, and what they cannot help doing at all. The body was carried to the vicarage drawing-room, where the fire had been laid but not yet lit. Dr. Exley, brisk but grave, directed 2 of the village constables in the careful, respectful business of moving Mr. Pember from the snow. She spoke quietly, as if afraid of breaking the air's thin tension. "Best to keep him out of the cold," she said. "And for heaven's sake, don't let Alice see him again just now. There's shock enough as it is." Miss Marple followed at a measured pace, pausing only once on the path. Her eyes traced the footprints again. 2 sets down, 1 set back. The returning prints were deeper, staggered, made by a man walking quickly or unsteadily. She bent slightly, studying the indentation, then straightened and glanced toward the hall windows, where faces hovered like ghosts behind the frosted glass. The snow was still falling. Soon the marks would vanish altogether. "So inconvenient snow," she murmured to herself. "So very obliging to those who tidy up after wickedness." Inside, the vicar's parlour was hushed but warm. Dr. Exley knelt again, confirming what had already been certain. "A blow to the back of the head," she said quietly. "Heavy, sudden, not self-inflicted. Death would have been near instant." Her tone was professional, almost detached, but Miss Marple saw how the doctor's fingers lingered on the coat sleeve, as if reluctant to let go of the human part beneath the diagnosis. Inspector Graves arrived from Market Cleeve shortly after, wrapped in a greatcoat still dusted with flakes. He was a capable man, though inclined to think well of efficiency and poorly of imagination. "Evening, Miss Marple," he said with a courteous nod. "You again, is it? I had a feeling your name would come up." Miss Marple's expression was mild. "Things do seem to happen, Inspector, even where one least expects them," he grunted. "They do at that. Now then, Dr. Exley tells me the deceased's name is Horace Pember, retired merchant lately of this parish. No sign of struggle, no weapon, no footprint save his own, and perhaps one other set, though the snows confused things. You were present when the alarm was raised?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "I was standing near the refreshment table. Alice Pember came in quite distraught. It was clear she had not expected to find her uncle in that condition. She discovered him, did she?" Graves noted it down with a small frown. "And the rest of you?" "We were all inside for the raffle drawing," said the Reverend Fenwick, who had entered quietly behind them. "Mr. Pember left the hall only a few minutes before. Said he wished for a breath of air, I believe. Did anyone follow him?" There was a pause. Clarissa Vale, standing near the hearth, lifted her chin slightly. "I stepped outside a moment earlier," she said, "only to fetch my wrap from the stand by the door. I saw Mr. Pember pass me smiling. He said something about the stars, though I don't think there were any visible through that snow." Graves looked up sharply. "And after that?" "I went back in. I was at the curiosities stall when the commotion began." Her voice was steady, her eyes cool. Miss Marple, who had been watching her with quiet interest, noted that the young woman's right glove was damp at the fingertips, the faintest shade darker than the left. She thought again of the little locket, the one Clarissa had retrieved from the snow, and wondered whether its chain had broken before or after the killing. Alice Pember was brought in a few minutes later, wrapped in Mrs. West's shawl and trembling like a leaf. She was a pretty, nervous creature in her mid-20s, with the soft features of one accustomed to depending on the good nature of others. "He wasn't ill," she kept saying. "Uncle Horace wasn't ill. We came to St. Giles because he wanted quiet, but he was happy here. Everyone liked him." Inspector Graves gave a small cough. "Did your uncle have enemies, Miss Pember? Any business disputes, quarrels, debts?" "None," she said quickly. "He'd been retired for years. He lived very quietly. He didn't—" "Oh," she broke off, staring down at her hands. "Except there was a man last week. Came to the cottage one evening when Uncle was out. Asked questions about him, odd questions. He said his name was Collier, I think. I told him to come back in the morning. But he didn't. Did your uncle mention the man?" "No, when I asked he said not to worry, that it was probably a mistake." Her voice faltered, but he looked troubled afterward. I remember because he dropped his spectacles into the fire, quite unlike him. Graves nodded. We'll trace this Collier. Likely nothing, but we'll see. He turned toward the Reverend Fenwick. I'll need a list of everyone present in the hall tonight. Of course, said the vicar, already composing names in his head. As the men spoke, Miss Marple's eyes drifted again to the dead man's coat, now hanging neatly on the stand. The crushed sprig of yew had been removed, but a faint brown smear remained on the lapel. Not blood, she thought. Resin. The same faint gleam she'd noticed on the stranger's fingers. And where was that stranger now? She asked quietly, did anyone see the tall gentleman who came in just before Alice returned? Dark overcoat, pale complexion, no gloves? Dr. Exley looked up. Yes, I saw him. He was by the door. Then, well, I suppose he went out again during the confusion. I don't remember seeing him afterward. No one does, Miss Marple said softly. Inspector Graves frowned. You're sure you didn't imagine him? Quite sure. I seldom imagine people who polish their fingers, she said mildly. The inspector gave a puzzled grunt, but he wrote it down nonetheless. Outside the wind rose, scattering the last traces of footprints in the snow. Within the vicarage the clock ticked with slow precision, each sound reminding the living that time moved on even when it shouldn't. Clarissa Vale had drawn slightly away from the others and now stood by the window, looking out into the darkness. Her face was pale, but her posture was composed. She might have been remembering something, or perhaps deciding to forget. Miss Marple watched her for a long moment, then turned back to the room, her thoughts threading together like stitches. There was a locket found where no locket should have been, a smear of resin where no man ought to have leaned, and a vanished stranger whose hands did not tremble in the cold. And behind it all, as she well knew, were the quiet things people never meant to tell, the jealousies, the bargains, the small betrayals buried under layers of civility. When the inspector had finished his questions, the villagers were allowed to go home. Mrs. Hardcastle left in tears, Mrs. West leading Alice gently by the arm. Dr. Exley promised to call in the morning. Clarissa Vale lingered, as though unwilling to walk the snow-covered lane alone. Miss Marple, drawing her shawl close, looked out at the whitened road. One can always tell, she said softly to herself, when something dreadful begins in a village. It's never the shouting that matters, it's the silences afterward. And as the door closed behind them all, the snow fell faster, smoothing away the marks of everything that had happened, leaving only the memory of what the night had taken. The following morning dawned cold and still, with a frost that turned every tree in St. Giles-on-Wear into a white sculpture. The village seemed subdued, its usual morning chatter replaced by murmurs that slipped from doorway to doorway. Curtains twitched when Miss Marple passed, though she, as always, appeared quite oblivious. She carried a small basket, ostensibly for a visit to Mrs. West's post office, but in truth her errand was more intricate. At the corner of High Street, she met Dr. Imogen Exley returning from the Pember cottage. The doctor looked tired, her breath forming little clouds in the air. He'd been dead scarcely 10 minutes when they found him, she said without preamble. A blow from behind. Something blunt, heavy and smooth. No tearing of the skin, which rules out anything jagged. Clean, quick, deliberate. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Not a quarrel, then. One rarely uses smooth objects in passion. Dr. Exley's brow furrowed. You're thinking again, Miss Marple? I'm always thinking, my dear. I just don't always say what about. The doctor smiled faintly, but glanced back toward the cottage. Poor Alice is still in shock. The police took the house keys, but I insisted she stay with Mrs. West until further notice. There's something wrong about all this. He wasn't the kind of man to make enemies. Oh, but that's a mistake people often make, Miss Marple said gently. It's the agreeable ones who collect the most grudges. They never notice them forming. Dr. Exley gave a short laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. I suppose you'd know. She patted Miss Marple's arm and walked on toward her surgery, her boots crunching the frost. Miss Marple continued to the post office. Mrs. West was inside, sleeves rolled up, sorting letters with unnecessary vigor. "Morning, Miss Marple. Dreadful business, isn't it? The inspector's been in already. Says they found nothing at all in the snow worth keeping." "Snow tidies things so inconveniently," Miss Marple agreed. "I don't suppose anyone mentioned seeing a tall gentleman. Thin, pale hands, no gloves, came in just before poor Mr. Pember was found." Mrs. West's hand paused over a stack of envelopes. "Now that you mention it, yes. Ada Perkins swears she saw someone standing near the gate while she was leaving the hall. Said he didn't speak when she wished him good night. Thought him odd, but then Ada always thinks someone's odd." "Why?" "I just wondered," Miss Marple said mildly. "One can tell a lot from hands. Gloves hide too much." Mrs. West leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Between you and me, Alice Pember was seen crying outside the butcher's the morning before last. Clarissa Vale was with her, odd pair that. Young Clarissa comforting her like a sister. Some said they'd quarrelled with Mr. Pember that week. He'd been cross about something, apparently. Something to do with money." "Money does make people cross," Miss Marple agreed, "especially when it used to be someone else's." She thanked Mrs. West for her time, bought a halfpenny stamp she did not need, and stepped back into the frozen morning. Her next call was at the Pember cottage, where Inspector Graves stood on the doorstep, smoking with the careful air of a man not enjoying his cigarette. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said. "I suppose you're here for a friendly chat, but you won't find much. We've searched from cellar to roof. No weapon, nothing disturbed. The man was struck from behind just outside his own gate. Do you think he was lured out?" Graves shrugged. "Or followed? Hard to say." He glanced toward the lane. "We did find a small wooden fragment on the path, smooth, rounded, like part of a walking stick, or maybe a tool handle. Might be nothing." "I'll have it tested. Wood, you say?" Miss Marple asked thoughtfully. "Not metal. Wood, polished. Smelled faintly of varnish," the constable said. Miss Marple's eyes brightened almost imperceptibly. "How curious." Graves gave her a wary look. "You've thought of something." "Oh, I never think of anything before breakfast. But if I were to think, I might wonder how a man like Mr. Pember, who prided himself on good manners, came to wear a sprig of yew pinned upside down. That's the funeral way, you know. Very unlucky." The inspector frowned. "Are you suggesting he did it himself?" "Not at all," she said gently. "But perhaps someone else thought to mock him with it." When Miss Marple left the cottage, she walked slowly toward the high street, her eyes following the faint trail where the snow had melted unevenly. She paused outside Clarissa Vale's little antique shop. The window display was neat, old watches, porcelain figurines, a few books, but behind the glass, Miss Marple could just discern Clarissa herself, moving deliberately as she arranged a set of brass candlesticks. Inside, the shop smelled faintly of polish and dust. Clarissa turned with a practiced smile. "Miss Marple, how kind. I was just putting things in order after the chaos of yesterday." "Such a dreadful thing," Miss Marple said softly. "I wondered if you'd sold many curiosities at the bazaar." "Very few," Clarissa replied. "People like to look more than buy. I donated most of what didn't sell." She hesitated, then added, "Including that silly little locket. I don't know why I picked it up again. It felt wrong to leave it lying in the snow." Miss Marple's gaze rested on her hands. "You've cleaned it, haven't you?" "Of course." "It was filthy." "Ah, then you saw what was inside?" Clarissa blinked. "Inside? It doesn't open." "Most things do if one knows how," Miss Marple murmured. "You might try the hinge at the side. It sticks a little from old polish." Clarissa's fingers hesitated, then pressed. With a faint click, the locket sprang open. Inside was a miniature photograph, badly faded but still visible. A young woman with dark hair and a solemn smile. Beneath it, folded neatly, was a scrap of paper with writing so small it was barely legible. Clarissa's face drained of colour. "I didn't know this was here." Miss Marple looked at the photograph, then up at her. "No, my dear, I rather think you didn't. But someone else did." Before Clarissa could speak, the bell over the door jingled. A tall figure entered, brushing snow from his coat sleeve. The same pale, gloveless hands Miss Marple had noticed the night before. His eyes flicked from Clarissa to Miss Marple, calm, assessing, almost amused. "Good morning," he said quietly. "I was hoping to inquire about a certain locket." Clarissa's fingers tightened over it instinctively. Miss Marple smiled with mild politeness, though her eyes had sharpened to a fine glint. "Oh, how fortunate," she said. "It seems, sir, that you've come just in time." And as the frost glittered on the window pane behind them, the room held that peculiar stillness that comes when truth begins, very quietly, to stir beneath the surface. The stranger's voice was smooth, too smooth, like polished wood. It held a faint trace of an accent, London perhaps, though softened by long practice. Clarissa Vale stood frozen behind the counter, her fingers still clutching the open locket. The tiny photograph gleamed faintly in the light from the window, the woman's face half lost to age and time. Miss Marple turned, the movement unhurried but watchful. "A locket, you say? How very coincidental. We were just admiring one, though I fear this particular piece is hardly for sale." The man smiled, polite but with something brittle beneath. "It might be of sentimental value to someone. An heirloom, perhaps. I've been looking for it for some time." Clarissa's voice, when it came, was low and tight. "You'll forgive me, sir, but I don't recall seeing you at the bazaar. This locket was found outside the village hall after the incident." He inclined his head slightly. "Yes, the tragedy. I was there, Miss Vale, though you may not have noticed me. Few did." His eyes flicked toward Miss Marple as he said it, as though testing whether she would confirm it. She merely smiled her mild, wool-soft smile and said nothing. Clarissa's hands trembled slightly, but she drew herself upright. "If the locket is yours, perhaps you can describe it. That would settle the matter neatly." The man hesitated for the briefest instant. Oval silver engraved with ivy leaves. Opens on a hinge to reveal a portrait. "The lady, dark hair, pale face." "A good description," Miss Marple said cheerfully, "though not so exact as one might expect from its rightful owner. For instance, you did not mention the inscription." "Inscription?" He blinked. "What inscription?" Clarissa glanced at her. "I didn't see any." Miss Marple took the locket gently from Clarissa's fingers, turned it so the light struck the inner rim, and tilted it. Along the narrow edge, nearly invisible, were faintly etched letters. "To E.M., for the winter that never ends." She read it aloud softly, as if reciting something sad and half forgotten. The stranger's expression did not change, but his breath caught ever so slightly. "So there is an inscription," he said. "Then I thank you for confirming it's the one I seek." "Indeed," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "And may one ask your connection to this?" "E.M.?" For a moment he seemed to weigh whether to lie or not. Then he said carefully, "Eleanor Marsh, she was my aunt. She died some years ago, and certain personal effects went missing from her estate. I've been trying to recover them." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Eleanor Marsh, how curious. There was, if I recall, a Miss Marsh once employed as companion to a Mrs. Drayton in Market Cleeve. She left rather suddenly, didn't she? Around the time Mr. Pember moved there to retire." He gave her a narrow look. "You seem remarkably well informed, madam." "Oh, not at all," she said sweetly. "I simply remember things. It's a dreadful habit of old age." Clarissa set the locket down on the counter. "If it truly belonged to your aunt, perhaps you can prove ownership. A letter, maybe? A family record?" "I'm afraid not. It was sentimental, not valuable." His gaze sharpened. "If you prefer, I could fetch someone to verify my identity. Inspector Graves, perhaps?" Miss Marple's eyes glimmered. "Oh, you know the inspector." "Only by reputation," he said evenly. "But I'm sure he'd be interested to hear that this trinket was found where a man lay dead." Clarissa flinched, the color draining from her cheeks. The air in the little shop seemed to tighten. Outside, the church bell struck noon, the sound distant but clear. Miss Marple broke the silence with a gentle cough. "If you don't mind, sir, Perhaps we might all take a more comfortable seat. Talking of death is better done sitting down." He hesitated again, then nodded curtly. They moved to the small table near the window. Clarissa fetched a pot of tea with trembling hands. Miss Marple poured for all three, her manner tranquil but her mind turning. She had seen that tremor before, not of fear alone but of conscience. Clarissa was frightened, yes, but not of this man, of something else that bound them both to Mr. Pember's death. When the stranger finally spoke again, his tone was different, lower, almost confiding. "I think we should be honest with one another. You both saw me last night, and you must have wondered what I was doing there." Clarissa stared. "You followed Mr. Pember." He did not deny it. "I came to speak with him. My aunt Eleanor Marsh was ruined by that man. He cheated her, ruined her reputation, left her penniless. She took her own life. I thought to confront him. But I swear to you, when I reached the gate, he was already dead." Clarissa let out a sharp breath. "You expect us to believe that?" Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. "Anger makes for clumsy liars, my dear," she said softly. "But this gentleman is not angry. He's careful, which is rather more interesting." The man met her eyes. "You think I killed him. I think," she said, "that you are very sure you did not, and that certainty may prove useful, because whoever did strike him meant to see him silenced, not punished." He frowned, uncertain. "Silenced? About what?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "About what all men of Mr. Pember's sort keep hidden, money, women, or both. And since your aunt and he were once acquainted, I should imagine her memory is closer to the matter than you realize." He said nothing, but his jaw tightened. Miss Marple continued softly, almost as if to herself. "It is remarkable how often secrets follow people into new parishes. One changes houses, names, even friendships, but guilt travels light and never far behind." Clarissa's cup rattled in its saucer. I don't know what you mean." "My dear, you do," Miss Marple said kindly. "For instance, you might tell us why Mr. Pember paid your rent these past 2 months." Clarissa froze. The stranger turned sharply toward her. "He did what?" She pressed her lips together, then spoke in a rush. "It wasn't what you think. He said he owed it to me for old times. I never asked for money." He insisted. "Old times?" The man repeated, eyes narrowing. "You knew him before you came here." Clarissa's voice dropped. "He was my guardian once. Before my mother died." A long silence followed. Outside, the frost was beginning to melt, drops falling from the eaves like tiny beads. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but in her mind the threads were tightening. So Clarissa had known Pember years ago. The locket belonged to a woman he'd wronged, and a stranger had come seeking justice, only to find death already waiting. Miss Marple set down her cup, eyes distant but thoughtful. "It seems, Mr. Collier, was it, that the past is rather more crowded than we supposed. Perhaps," she said gently, "we should pay a little visit to Market Cleeve. I have an old friend there who remembers all sorts of inconvenient things." And as the man's gaze met hers, wary and uncertain, she smiled her mild, infuriating smile, the one that always came in St. Mary Mead or anywhere else, just before Miss Marple began to unravel a life. It was late afternoon by the time Miss Marple and Mr. Collier reached Market Cleeve. The village lay about 6 miles from St. Giles-on-Wear, a modest collection of neat houses and crooked chimneys nestled round a square with a duck pond in the centre. A cold mist clung to the cobbles, blurring the outlines of shop signs and the single gas lamp that flickered against the gathering dusk. Miss Marple walked at her usual measured pace, her scarf tucked neatly under her chin, while Mr. Collier followed beside her, his long stride deliberately slowed to match hers. They had spoken little during the journey. The rhythmic sound of the omnibus wheels had given Miss Marple time to think, and she had spent it knitting a small square of grey wool with deceptive serenity. When she finally broke the silence, her tone was conversational, almost mild. "It's always curious how people imagine a village is a quiet place. I have never known one yet that wasn't humming like a beehive once you lifted the lid. Mr. Collier gave a short laugh. You think that's what we're doing? Lifting the lid? Oh, my dear man, the lid's been rattling for years. We're merely seeing who's inside. They alighted near the post office, where a faint smell of paraffin and paper hung in the air. Miss Marple led the way toward a narrow lane flanked by holly bushes. Mrs. Drayton's house is at the end, she said. She employed Miss Marsh many years ago. A nervous sort of woman, but she remembers things in great detail when prompted. I find nervous people often do. Mrs. Drayton proved to be exactly as Miss Marple had described, a thin woman with anxious eyes and fingers that fluttered like moths. She received them in a parlour that smelled faintly of lavender polish and damp coal. Eleanor Marsh. Oh dear, yes, I remember her, she said, lowering herself into a chair. She was with me for nearly 2 years. A quiet creature, always reading letters she never seemed to send. Left quite suddenly one spring. Said she'd had a proposal of marriage, though she never mentioned the gentleman's name. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. You wouldn't happen to know where she went afterward? I believe she stayed a while in London. There was talk she'd taken up with some businessman from the north. People will talk, you know. Mrs. Drayton hesitated, her gaze flickering toward Mr. Collier. Forgive me, sir. You remind me a little of her. Something about the eyes. He looked away. She was my aunt. Mrs. Drayton clasped her hands together, her face softening. Oh, my dear. Then you must have heard how unhappy she was at the end. Such a shame. She was frightened of something those last few months, jumped at every letter, every sound at the door. I thought perhaps she owed someone money, but when she left she burned nearly all her papers. The one she kept was a photograph, a man older than her, rather distinguished. She told me once he'd promised her everything. It was her undoing. Miss Marple's eyes glinted faintly behind her spectacles. Would you recognize him again if you saw him? I might. The photograph showed him with a peculiar stick, polished like a piece of furniture. I remember that most of all. He held it proudly as if it meant something. Indeed, Miss Marple murmured. A stick. How very interesting. They thanked Mrs. Drayton and left. Outside, the mist had thickened, curling like breath along the hedgerows. Mr. Collier walked in silence until they reached the square again. You think that man was Pember? I'm quite sure of it, Miss Marple said. And if so, he had more than one reason to be killed. When one lives by deception, one tends to leave a trail of hearts behind, broken or otherwise. He looked grim. If he ruined my aunt, I can't pity him, but I still didn't kill him. I believe you, she said simply. But someone used your arrival as cover. Murderers are opportunists. They strike when the noise is loud enough to hide the blow. Back in St. Giles-on-Wear, the investigation had moved quickly. Inspector Graves had questioned the villagers again, his manner increasingly impatient. Alice Pember, still pale from shock, swore her uncle had received a letter 2 days before his death that upset him greatly. She had not read it, but the envelope bore a London postmark. No such letter was found among his things. By the time Miss Marple and Mr. Collier returned that evening, the constables had already finished their search of the cottage. Miss Marple walked through the little parlour, touching nothing but observing everything. The half-melted candle, the hearth swept too clean, the faint smell of varnish that lingered on the table's edge. She paused by the writing desk and examined a faint circular stain. Teacup, she said softly, but no saucer. Her visitor who wasn't meant to stay long. Mr. Collier watched her. You think someone came here before he went to the hall? I think, she replied, that Mr. Pember was already uneasy. He may have intended to meet someone that night, and they preferred the cold to conversation. She picked up a small scrap of paper from under the desk, a torn corner from an envelope. Only 3 letters were visible, M.V. She slipped it into her handkerchief. Later, when the inspector arrived to report his lack of progress, Miss Marple handed him the fragment. Perhaps your men might look for a letter sent from Market Cleeve, she said. The return address of MV, I think. Graves frowned. I've been busy, Miss Marple. One does one's knitting where one finds the wool, she said, smiling. Now tell me, Inspector, did you notice anything peculiar about Mr. Pember's stick? His stick? It wasn't found with him. We assumed he'd dropped it somewhere on the way to the hall. Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. No, it wasn't dropped. It was used. When he left, Mr. Collier turned to her, startled. You think the walking stick was the weapon? Precisely. Polished wood, smooth, heavy. It would match Dr. Exley's description perfectly. And, if I'm not mistaken, the handle would bear traces of varnish, the same I smelt at the cottage. He drew a sharp breath. Then whoever took it killed him, she finished gently. And since it wasn't recovered, we must ask who had reason to hide such an inconvenient object. The next morning brought another layer of frost and, with it, a new ripple of gossip through the village. Mrs. Hardcastle, never one to resist a dramatic entrance, rushed into the post office declaring that Clarissa Vale's shop had been broken into during the night. Nothing was stolen. Nothing except, it seemed, a single brass candlestick from the display window. Miss Marple, sitting near the stove with her knitting, looked up calmly. A brass candlestick? How very specific. One wonders why anyone would risk so much for so little. Mrs. West shuddered. Perhaps it's the same wicked soul who killed poor Mr. Pember. Perhaps, Miss Marple said softly, folding her hands over her knitting. Or perhaps someone is tidying up again. For a long moment, the little post office was silent save for the crackle of the fire. Outside, the church bell tolled the hour, slow and deliberate like a warning. Miss Marple listened, her eyes half closed, the pattern forming quietly in her mind. The locket, the stick, the missing letter, the polished wood, and now the candlestick, every thread weaving closer to the hand that had set them all in motion. She smiled faintly to herself, the smile of someone who has begun to see, just faintly, the shape of truth beneath the snow. The news of the break-in travelled faster than the frost could melt. By noon, the entire village had formed its theories, each more dramatic than the last. Some whispered of London thieves, others of a curse on the Pember family. Clarissa Vale, pale and visibly shaken, stood in the doorway of her little shop, answering Inspector Graves's questions with the weary patience of someone who has already been judged by rumour. Miss Marple, who had arrived quietly with her knitting bag, lingered inside, her eyes tracing the floor where the snow had been tracked in and melted in small puddles near the counter. The inspector's tone was clipped. "And you say nothing else was taken? Not the cash, not the jewellery?" "Nothing," Clarissa said softly. "Only that one candlestick. I didn't even notice it was missing until I saw the empty space this morning." Graves grunted, scribbling in his notebook. "Strange sort of thief. Breaks a lock for a lump of brass. Unless," Miss Marple said gently, "the thief was not looking for value but for something hidden." Graves turned to her, impatient but curious. "Hidden, you say? Oh, yes. People hide things in the oddest places. Letters, keys, even bits of conscience. And candlesticks are wonderfully hollow." Clarissa looked up sharply. "You think something was inside it?" Miss Marple smiled. "It's only a possibility, my dear. But if I were inclined to conceal a letter that might ruin me or someone else, I should choose something that would never draw attention." Graves sighed. "Then whoever took it must have known it was there." "Precisely," Miss Marple murmured. When the inspector left to inspect the broken latch, Miss Marple remained behind under the pretext of helping Clarissa straighten the display. The young woman's hands trembled as she set the porcelain figures back in their places. "Miss Marple," she said at last, barely above a whisper, "you believe I know more than I've told." The older woman didn't look up. "I believe, my dear, that you are frightened. And when people are frightened, they make two kinds of mistakes: silence when they ought to speak, and speaking when they ought to keep quiet." Clarissa's breath caught. "If I tell you something, will you promise not to tell the police?" "My dear girl," Miss Marple said kindly, One never promises until one knows what one is promising about. But you may trust me to do what's right." Clarissa hesitated, glancing at the door as though afraid someone might be listening. "The candlestick wasn't mine. Mr. Pember gave it to me 2 nights before he died." "Indeed?" Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her eyes sharpened. "And did he say why?" "He said it was old family silver, though it's brass, and that he wanted me to keep it safe. I didn't think much of it at the time, but when the break-in happened, I realized someone must have known he gave it to me." Miss Marple folded her knitting calmly. "Did you tell anyone about it?" Clarissa shook her head. "Only Alice. She came to the shop the morning after he died, distraught. I wanted to comfort her. I mentioned he'd given me the candlestick. She said nothing, just stared at me in a way that made me uneasy." Miss Marple said nothing for a long moment. The ticking of the wall clock filled the silence. Then she said softly, "Alice Pember is a dear girl, but grief sometimes makes people do strange things. Still, it would take more than sorrow to break a lock in the night." That evening, as dusk settled again over St. Giles-on-Wear, Miss Marple sat by her parlour fire with her knitting idle on her lap. She was thinking of sticks and candlesticks, of varnish and polish, of wood and brass, of the curious symmetry between the weapon that had vanished and the object stolen. A stick could kill, a candlestick could hide. Both gleamed when rubbed clean. Her reverie was broken by a knock at the door. It was Dr. Exley, snow-dusted and brisk as ever. "Forgive me for calling unannounced, but I thought you should know the inspector sent word. They found the missing stick." Miss Marple's brows rose. "Have they indeed?" "In the river by the mill. A boy found it snagged in a branch. Heavy thing, with a carved handle and a smear of varnish along the side. They're certain it's Pember's." Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes alight. "And was there anything inside it, Doctor?" "Inside it? Oh, yes. Walking sticks, like candlesticks, can sometimes hold things better left unseen." Dr. Exley smiled faintly. "If you're right, the inspector will owe you another apology. He's having it examined in the morning." "Quite so," Miss Marple murmured. "But I shouldn't wait for morning if I were him. Things tend to vanish again when the night's long enough." After the doctor left, Miss Marple sat very still. The fire crackled, casting shadows that trembled against the curtains. She thought of the snow outside, of how it covered tracks but could not disguise the way a person walked. She thought of Clarissa's fear, of Alice's silence, and of a letter sent from Market Cleeve that had never been found. Somewhere she was sure that letter was waiting to be read, its words the key to everything. When she finally rose, it was with the unhurried grace of someone who had already decided her next step. Tomorrow she would visit Alice Pember at Mrs. West's cottage. Grief, she knew, had many shapes, and sometimes it wore the face of guilt, pretending to be sorrow. Morning came grey and quiet, the kind of stillness that seemed to hush even the sparrows. Miss Marple stepped out into the cold with her shawl tucked close, following the narrow lane that curved toward Mrs. West's cottage. The frost was crisp underfoot, the air heavy with the faint scent of coal smoke. She had spent much of the night knitting and thinking, 2 activities that suited each other, for both relied on the slow, patient linking of threads. Mrs. West opened the door before Miss Marple had time to knock. "You're early," she said, surprised but not displeased. "Alice is just having tea. Poor thing's barely touched a bite since the funeral arrangements began." "Then perhaps she'll take a cup if I join her," Miss Marple said kindly. "Grief doesn't like to eat alone." Mrs. West nodded, bustling away to fetch another cup. Miss Marple stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim parlour light. Alice Pember sat near the fire, a small figure wrapped in a shawl too big for her, her eyes red from weeping. She looked up, startled, and tried to smile. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't expect—" "My dear, you've had too many expectations lately," Miss Marple said gently, seating herself opposite. "How are you bearing up?" Alice's lips trembled. "I don't know. It feels like I'm walking in a dream. Everyone keeps asking questions, the inspector, Dr. Exley, even Clarissa. They all want to know what Uncle said that night, but I don't remember anything unusual. Miss Marple stirred her tea, watching the steam rise. Sometimes what seems unimportant at the time proves most telling later. For instance, you mentioned before that your uncle received a letter from London. I wondered if you've remembered anything else about it. The handwriting, the seal, the tone of it. Alice shook her head slowly. It was plain. He read it at breakfast, then folded it into his pocket. I asked if it was bad news, and he said— She stopped, frowning faintly. He said, "Nothing that can't be buried." I thought he meant forgotten. Perhaps he did, Miss Marple murmured. And yet, burying and forgetting are not always the same thing. She looked at the girl over the rim of her cup. You mustn't think me intrusive, my dear, but I hear you were kind enough to visit Miss Vale the morning after his death. Alice's shoulders stiffened. Yes, she seemed upset. I thought she might know something about the quarrel Uncle had that week. Ah, said Miss Marple softly, the quarrel. People do quarrel with those they feel safest with. You told the inspector it was about money, I think. Alice nodded quickly. He'd lent her some, that's all. He was always generous, perhaps too generous, but I'm sure she meant to pay him back. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Generosity is a curious thing. It often comes with invisible strings. And when the giver begins to pull, the receiver may panic. Alice looked down at her hands. You think Clarissa killed him, don't you? My dear, I think no such thing. But I do think someone wanted to make it seem as though she might have. The girl looked up sharply, confusion clouding her grief. You mean the locket? Or the candlestick? Both, Miss Marple said, her voice quiet but firm. Your uncle gave Miss Vale that candlestick just before his death, ostensibly as a gift, but really to hide something. When it was stolen, the thief knew exactly what to take. As for the locket, it reappeared just where it would cause the most suspicion. One might almost believe the murderer wished to throw all the blame upon her. Alice's fingers tightened around her teacup. But who would do such a thing? That, Miss Marple said, leaning back, is precisely what I came to ask you. For a moment the only sound was the ticking of the mantel clock. Then Alice's composure broke. I can't, she whispered. I can't tell you. You'll think me wicked. My dear, Miss Marple said softly, I've lived long enough to know that wickedness often grows from fear, not malice. Tell me the truth, and we shall see what sort it is. Alice pressed her hands to her face. When she spoke again, her voice was muffled. Uncle had secrets. I found out by accident. There was a drawer in his study locked. One day he left the key behind. Inside were letters, dozens, from women. One of them was from my mother. Miss Marple's knitting fingers stilled in her lap. Your mother? Alice nodded, tears streaming down her face. I never knew. He'd promised to marry her before she met my father. Then he withdrew, said she wasn't suitable. She wrote him after my father died, begging for help, but he never replied. That letter, it was the one from London. She died last winter, and I sent it back to him myself. I signed it with her initials, E.M., Eleanor Mayfield. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her voice remained calm. E.M., the same inscription as on the locket. Yes, he gave that locket to my mother once. I only wanted him to remember her, to feel remorse. And did he? Alice shook her head violently. He laughed, said women were sentimental fools. I couldn't bear it. I ran out into the snow. When I came back later, after the raffle, I saw him lying there. I thought God had done it for me. Miss Marple rose slowly, her expression unreadable. You didn't strike him. No. I swear I didn't. But I didn't tell anyone what I'd done either. If they found out about the letter, about my mother, they'd think you had reason, Miss Marple finished gently. Yes, my dear, they might. She reached out and laid a hand on the girl's shoulder. But it wasn't you. Someone else knew about that letter. Someone who wanted to be sure it never came to light. Alice looked up, wide-eyed. Who? Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes far away. The one person clever enough to hide guilt behind pity. and careless enough to polish brass by lamplight on the very night of a murder. She drew her shawl tighter and turned toward the door. "Rest now, my dear. I think it's time I paid another visit to Clarissa Vale." And as she stepped back into the cold, the morning light caught in the frost-like glass, the world outside shining with cruel, deceptive beauty, much like the truth she was walking toward. The wind had grown sharper by the time Miss Marple reached the high street. The afternoon light had a silvery pallor, the sort that flattened every colour and made even the most familiar cottages seem faintly ghostly. She paused at the corner by the green, where the snow had been trampled into a hard glaze, and looked toward Clarissa Vale's shop. The blinds were half drawn, and a thin column of smoke rose from the chimney, steady, deliberate, as though its maker had been sitting by that fire for some time, thinking. Miss Marple entered quietly, the small bell over the door tinkling its fragile note. Clarissa was behind the counter, her hands busy with a stack of ledgers that she was not truly reading. When she looked up and saw Miss Marple, something flickered across her face, an attempt at composure that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Miss Marple," she said, forcing a small smile. "I wasn't expecting visitors. Not after the inspector's latest round of questions. My dear, one should never expect visitors. They tend to arrive when the kettle's cold," Miss Marple replied pleasantly, taking a seat near the fire. "I thought we might have a little chat before things get too terribly settled in the wrong direction." Clarissa hesitated. "If this is about the candlestick—" "Oh, everything is about the candlestick, I'm afraid," Miss Marple said mildly, warming her hands. "You see, I've begun to think it wasn't simply a hiding place. It was also a message." The younger woman frowned. "A message?" "Yes, from Mr. Pember to you." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her knitting bag resting on her lap. "You said he gave it to you 2 nights before his death, and that he claimed it was valuable family silver. But Mr. Pember, as we now know, had no family left, not truly. His niece Alice was taken in for kindness' sake, but his past was, how shall we say, unaccompanied." Clarissa's fingers tightened around the edge of the ledger. "I don't know what you mean." "Oh, I think you do," Miss Marple said softly. "He wanted to unburden himself, but not to the police, not even to his niece. To you, Miss Vale, because you reminded him of someone he had wronged long ago." Clarissa's colour drained. "You can't possibly know that." Miss Marple regarded her gently. "You see, I had a most enlightening talk with Mrs. Drayton in Market Cleeve. She remembered a Miss Eleanor Marsh, once companion to her. Lovely, clever, a little too trusting. She also remembered that Miss Marsh kept a photograph of a man holding a polished walking stick, the same sort of stick found in the river yesterday." Clarissa turned away, her voice trembling. "I don't want to hear this." "Nevertheless, you must. Mr. Pember promised marriage to Miss Marsh and betrayed her, leaving her ruined." "Your mother, wasn't she?" Clarissa froze, every trace of pretense gone. "How did you—" "It was written on your face the night of the bazaar," Miss Marple said softly. "When you saw the locket, you looked as if you'd seen a ghost." "Because you had. The woman in the photograph was your mother. The locket was hers once, and you recognized it." Clarissa's breath came unevenly. "He never knew who I was. I came here to confront him, but I couldn't. He was charming, you see, kind, generous. I began to think perhaps I'd been wrong. Perhaps Mother had exaggerated her sorrow. And then the night of the bazaar came, and I saw him with that woman, Alice, and he looked so proud of himself. I felt sick." Miss Marple's voice was gentle, but her gaze unflinching. "You followed him outside, didn't you?" Clarissa's eyes filled with tears. "Yes. I only wanted to speak to him. I wanted him to know who I was." But he laughed. He said my mother had sent me to beg, that I was as foolish as she'd been. I don't remember picking up the stick. I only remember him falling. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock. Clarissa buried her face in her hands. "It was an accident," she whispered. "I didn't mean to kill him." Miss Marple sat very still. There was pity in her expression, but no surprise. "No," she said quietly. You didn't mean to. But panic makes the best of us quite foolish. You hid the stick, didn't you? And later, when you realized the candlestick held your mother's letter, the one Mr. Pember never answered, you took it back. You thought if the police found it, they'd know everything. Clarissa nodded miserably. I hid it in the river the same night, but someone saw me. I think it must have been Alice. The next morning she came to me, pale as death. She said nothing, but there was something in her eyes. I think she guessed. Miss Marple sighed softly. Yes, she guessed, and then she pitied you. You see, my dear, she believed in justice, but not the kind that brings people to the gallows. That's why she stayed silent. Clarissa lifted her head, her voice shaking. What will you do? Miss Marple rose slowly, her face unreadable. My dear, I shall do what must be done. Inspector Graves will hear the truth, though perhaps not quite all of it. A foolish quarrel, a fall, a frightened woman. These things happen, but as for the letter, it will not be mentioned. The dead have caused enough harm. Clarissa looked at her in disbelief. You'd protect me? Miss Marple gave a faint, rueful smile. Protect? No. But I see no good in destroying 2 lives when one has already paid the price. Besides, your mother was a kind woman once, and she deserves peace, don't you think? As she turned to leave, Clarissa's quiet sobs filled the little shop. Outside, the snow had begun again, soft and unrelenting. Miss Marple walked home slowly through the falling white, her thoughts heavy yet calm. Human nature, she mused, was like the winter itself, beautiful from a distance, treacherous up close. And by the time she reached her cottage, the world behind her had already begun to hide its sins beneath a new, unbroken blanket of snow. The following morning brought a thin, uneasy sunlight that did little to warm the frost, still clinging to the hedgerows. The village was quiet, too quiet, Miss Marple thought, as she stepped into her sitting room to find a sealed envelope pushed neatly beneath her door. She recognized the handwriting at once, small, controlled, and faintly elegant, with the kind of precision that came from years of practice concealing one's emotions. Clarissa Vale inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice and creased at the corners. I cannot bear to wait for the police to come, it read. Please forgive me. You were right. Mother deserves peace. I'm going to her now. Miss Marple set the letter down slowly, the faint tremor in her hand the only sign of alarm. She wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders and stepped out into the biting air, moving quickly for a woman of her years. The church bell had just struck 9 when she reached the bridge that crossed the river. There, leaning against the frost-rimmed rail, stood Inspector Graves, his face grave and cold. She's gone into the water, he said quietly. A fisherman saw her coat floating by the bend. We've men downstream looking now. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment, the pale morning light gleaming against her white hair. Poor child, she murmured. She hadn't the courage to face what she'd done, and yet she faced something far worse instead. Graves gave a long sigh. You knew, didn't you? About her and Pember. I knew enough, Miss Marple said softly, but I hoped she might find a way to live with the truth. The young are not always as strong as they seem. The inspector rubbed his chin, glancing toward the dark water that slipped quietly beneath the ice. There's something still wrong about it, though. She left her shop in perfect order. Her ledgers closed, the fire damped. Doesn't feel like a woman planning to disappear. Miss Marple looked up sharply. Then perhaps she didn't plan to. Graves frowned. You mean? Suicide is often convenient to those who wish to close a case neatly, she said gently. But it would be very foolish of us to do so without asking a few questions. For instance, who knew she'd confessed to me yesterday? Graves blinked. You told someone. Only Dr. Exley in confidence. I thought it might ease the inspector's work later on. Then the circle's small, Graves muttered. But if someone else overheard... Miss Marple's eyes moved toward the horizon, where the mill chimney cut the pale sky. I think someone did. And if I am right, the same person who saw Clarissa hide the stick in the river also followed her again this morning. She turned from the bridge, her step brisk despite the cold. Herr Inspector, we must go to the vicarage. By the time they arrived, the Reverend Fenwick was at his desk, a ledger open before him, and his spectacles balanced precariously on the end of his nose. He looked up with mild surprise as they entered. "Miss Marple, Inspector. Is this about poor Miss Vale? I heard dreadful rumours." "Rumours travel quickly in St. Giles," Miss Marple said, studying his expression carefully. "You were close to her, I think. She often helped at church events, didn't she?" The vicar hesitated. "She did. A good woman, I thought. Quiet, thoughtful. And yet," Miss Marple continued, "she had enemies. People who might have wanted her silence. For instance, someone who knew of Mr. Pember's affairs and feared she might speak of them." Fenwick blinked rapidly behind his glasses. "Really, Miss Marple, I don't know what you mean." "Oh, but you do," she said, her voice still kind, almost pitying. "You see, Mr. Pember's old letters did not vanish into the fire, as we thought. Some were saved. Kept by the church, in fact, where they were found years ago when you took your post. You recognized Eleanor Marsh's name. You knew what sort of man Pember was. And when Clarissa came to St. Giles, you realized the truth at once. She was her mother's daughter, wasn't she?" The vicar's hand trembled slightly. "You have no proof of this." "Proof?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, I'm afraid there's quite a bit. The varnish on Pember's coat, for instance. It was identical to the polish used on the pew rails, the kind you handle every week. The yew sprig pinned to his lapel was taken from the churchyard hedge, not his garden. And your sermon that Sunday, you spoke of sin buried beneath snow. An apt metaphor, I thought, for a man who hoped a murder might pass for divine punishment." Graves stepped forward. "You killed Pember?" Fenwick's composure cracked. "I ruined her," he burst out. "He ruined Eleanor Marsh, and I loved her. She came to me for solace when the world would not forgive her. I begged her to leave the village, but shame killed her long before illness did. And when I saw him again, smiling, welcomed, pretending to be a man of honor, I knew there could be no peace until he was gone." Miss Marple's expression softened, but her tone remained steady. "And so you followed him that night, struck him down with his own stick and left him in the snow. When Clarissa arrived, you thought Providence had sent you a scapegoat. But conscience has a way of surviving even righteousness." The vicar bowed his head, his voice barely a whisper. "I meant to protect her. I never meant to harm her." "Yet you did," Miss Marple said gently. "You let her believe the guilt was hers until it destroyed her." Graves motioned to the constable waiting by the door. "You'd better come with us, Reverend." When they had gone, Miss Marple stood alone in the cold nave, the pale light falling across the worn pews. She looked toward the altar, where a single candle burned low, its flame shivering in the draught. "Human nature," she murmured to herself, "is so dreadfully consistent. We mean to do right, and somehow we do wrong. Always tidy, always polite, and always so very tragic." Outside, the river kept flowing, silent and unjudging, carrying with it the last traces of snow, and with them, perhaps, the village's brief memory of the winter's first victim. It was several days before the village of St. Giles-on-Wear returned to its careful rhythm, though the hush that followed the revelations lingered longer than the snow itself. The frost had gone, replaced by a damp grey thaw that made the hedges drip and the cobbles shine. The church bell, once the heart of village comfort, now tolled with a slow reluctance, as though even it felt the weight of confession. Miss Marple sat by her parlour fire, the newspaper folded neatly beside her. The headline said enough: "Vicar admits to killing retired merchant." But newspapers were poor judges of truth, she thought. They printed facts, never consequences. She had spent the morning knitting in silence, the click of her needles the only sound in the room. The fire popped occasionally, as though commenting softly on the folly of human nature. When a knock came at her door, she knew who it would be before she rose. Dr. Imogen Exley stood outside, her coat damp, her expression drawn with the weary decency of someone who had seen too much of death in too short a span. "May I come in, Miss Marple?" "Of course, my dear. You look chilled to the bone. Sit near the fire." The doctor accepted gratefully, rubbing her hands together. "It's all finished now. Graves took Fenwick to the county jail this morning. He didn't resist. Kept saying he'd done God's will, poor fool." Miss Marple poured tea with her usual serenity. "The Almighty must be quite exhausted with the number of errands people run in his name." Dr. Exley gave a bleak laugh. "You knew, didn't you? Even before the inspector suspected?" "I saw enough to wonder," Miss Marple said, stirring her cup. "When a man speaks often of forgiveness yet cannot forgive himself, one must look for the sin beneath the sermon." Fenwick's eyes always strayed to Miss Vale when he preached, half pity, half dread. "The past does cling rather like soot in a chimney." The doctor leaned back, sighing. "It's a terrible thing, guilt. She might have lived, you know, Clarissa. They found her body downstream yesterday afternoon. Poor girl." Miss Marple's hands paused just for a moment. "Yes," she said softly. "I feared they would. Do you think she'd ever have confessed if she hadn't believed herself guilty?" "Oh, very likely. Guilt is infectious, Dr. Exley. One need not commit the sin to feel the stain of it. Clarissa thought she'd struck her mother's ghost as much as Mr. Pember." The doctor nodded slowly, understanding but still unsettled. "I'll never grow used to how calm you are about it all." "My dear," Miss Marple replied, smiling faintly, "it isn't calm, it's resignation. When one lives long enough, one learns that tragedy, like influenza, visits nearly every household in due course." There was a knock again. Brisk, official. Inspector Graves entered without waiting for invitation, removing his hat respectfully. He looked weary but less combative than usual, as if recent events had taken some of the starch out of him. "Miss Marple, Doctor," he said, nodding to each. "I thought I'd stop by. The superintendent wanted me to thank you. We might never have pieced it together without your help." "I merely noticed things others had the sense to overlook," she said mildly. "You, after all, did the actual work." Graves gave a rueful grin. "You noticed the yew sprig, the polish, the missing stick, the whole pattern of it. That's more than I did. I still don't understand how you manage it." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Oh, it's very simple. Every village has its types. Once you've watched human nature at close quarters, you see it repeat itself endlessly. There's always a jealous lover, a penitent liar, a gossip who knows too much, and a saint who sins in secret. Only the names change." Graves shook his head in admiration. "You make it sound like common arithmetic." "Arithmetic, perhaps," she said, "but with very untidy sums." He hesitated, clearing his throat. "There is one matter still troubling me. We recovered the letter from the candlestick, the one from Eleanor Marsh. It was quite as damning as you suggested." "Why didn't you mention it sooner?" Miss Marple smiled serenely. "Because it would have served no purpose but cruelty. Clarissa was already punishing herself, and as for the Reverend, he knew its contents well enough without reading them again. Sometimes mercy is the only proper evidence." The inspector looked at her a long moment, then sighed. "I'll not argue with that. I suppose there's justice, and then there's the kind people can actually live with." "Precisely," Miss Marple said, "and they are rarely the same." When he had gone, Dr. Exley lingered by the hearth. The fire had burned low, a deep red glow that softened the edges of everything it touched. "Do you ever tire of it?" she asked quietly. "The ugliness of it all, these things people do to each other." Miss Marple looked into the flames. "No," she said after a moment. "I tire of the sorrow, yes, but never of the pattern. Each act of wickedness reminds me that good is still possible. You see, evil is dreadfully logical. It always reveals itself if one only waits long enough." The doctor smiled faintly, as though half comforted, and rose to leave. "You're an extraordinary woman, Miss Marple." "Nonsense. I simply pay attention." When the door closed behind her, Miss Marple sat for a while longer, listening to the wind stir the bare branches outside. The kettle whistled softly from the hearth, but she made no move to pour another cup. Her thoughts had turned to the faces she'd seen in recent days, the penitent vicar, the frightened girl, the angry man, the villagers whispering behind closed curtains. It was always the same in the end. Beneath the politeness and the lace curtains, There ran that deep, unchanging current of desire, pride, love, and fear. She rose and drew the curtains back. The sun had broken through at last, faint but resolute, lighting the wet roofs and glistening paths of St. Giles-on-Wear. Somewhere children were laughing again, their voices carrying on the clean, cold air. Life, as it always did, was beginning to stitch itself together, ragged but whole. Miss Marple smiled, not with triumph, but with quiet understanding. The winter's first victim had been laid to rest, and with her perhaps the season's bitterness. But she knew that come spring, there would be new blossoms, new gossip, new kindnesses, and inevitably new sins. And when they came, as they always did, she would be here to notice them, with her knitting, her tea, and her unflinching eyes that saw through snow, through sorrow, and through the fragile hearts of men. The days that followed were quiet, as though the village itself had exhaled after holding its breath too long. The scandal of the vicar's arrest had spread quickly beyond St. Giles-on-Wear, drawing a brief storm of outsiders, reporters, constables, and curious townsfolk, but soon even they drifted away, leaving the village to its customary hush. Snowmelt trickled down the lanes, and crocuses began to show timidly through the softening ground. Life, as it always did, resumed its rhythm of tea, gossip, and small polite deceptions. Miss Marple, however, was in no haste to forget. She spent her mornings by the fire, knitting something white and soft that might have been a shawl, though no one knew for whom. Visitors came and went, Dr. Exley with her medical bag and thoughtful silences, Mrs. West with her unstoppable news from the post office, but Miss Marple remained her usual mild self, smiling and listening, her eyes far away. It was not until the Sunday after the vicar's confession that she walked once more to the church. The new curate, a fresh-faced young man sent hastily from the diocese, was taking his first service. He read the prayers earnestly, but stumbled on the sermon as though aware of the ghost still lingering in the pews. Miss Marple sat in her usual place near the window, watching the light fall through the coloured glass, and when the final hymn faded, she lingered while the others left. Dr. Exley joined her, pulling on her gloves. "A different atmosphere, isn't it?" she murmured. "As though the church itself were trying to forget." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Churches have seen too much ever to forget, my dear. They simply grow used to remembering quietly." Outside, they walked together through the churchyard, where the last traces of snow glistened among the stones. At the far end, near the yew hedge, lay two new graves, the one for Mr. Pember, with its proper brass plaque, and beside it, smaller and simpler, Clarissa Vale. Someone, perhaps Alice, had left a single white crocus on the mound. Dr. Exley stopped, her expression unreadable. "I keep wondering whether the truth did any good in the end." Miss Marple looked down at the flowers, her breath misting in the cold air. "Truth seldom does good in the moment. It's too sharp, too bright. But later, when the air has cleared, it has a way of setting things right." She glanced at the names carved into the stones. "You see, my dear, the truth doesn't heal the living. It lays the dead to rest." The doctor nodded slowly, then excused herself, called away by the duties of the living. Miss Marple remained. The churchyard was very still, the air filled with that faint sound winter makes when it begins to loosen its grip. She bent carefully, her knees protesting a little, and brushed a small patch of snow from Clarissa's headstone. "Poor child," she murmured. "You meant only to make the past speak, and it shouted too loudly for you to bear it." She straightened, her hand resting briefly on the stone. "You see, my dear, it's not the wicked who make the world tragic. It's the good who cannot forgive." As she turned to go, she noticed Alice Pember standing a few yards away, pale but composed, her gloved hands clasped before her. Their eyes met. No words were needed. Alice stepped forward and whispered, "You were right," about her and about him. "I'll see that her grave is tended." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Do that, my dear. It's the least kindness one can offer." They parted with quiet understanding. By the time Miss Marple reached her cottage, the sun had slipped low, catching the rooftops in soft gold. She set aside her shawl, took up her teacup, and allowed herself a small sigh, the sort of sigh that belongs to those who have seen the worst of human frailty and can still find it forgivable. On the table beside her lay the newspaper again, folded to the story's end. Vicar's confession brings closure to village mystery. Miss Marple smiled faintly at the phrase. Closure was a thing reporters invented. In life one never truly closed anything. The patterns simply wound themselves into new ones, different names, different sorrows, but always the same threads of love, vanity, guilt and fear. The clock on the mantel chimed softly. She rose, poured fresh tea and looked out of the window. Children were playing on the green, their laughter clear in the crisp air, and a robin hopped along the garden wall. The world was continuing as it must. Miss Marple watched it for a long moment, then spoke quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. Yes, she said, the winter's first victim and perhaps the last. But spring always follows, doesn't it? And spring forgives everything. Then she returned to her chair, the firelight warm against her face, her needles clicking once more, steady, precise and unhurried, while outside the snow melted away from the earth she had so patiently understood.